She projected the phrase with her whole body, leaning tightly toward the mic as if her words were a triumphant banner being driven deep into the ground. I have committed my entire career to supporting the people of Venezuela. The room appeared to agree simultaneously, and a few political assistants positioned behind her mirrored the motion. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez let that statement hang in the brilliantly lit committee space, employing the precise silence required to allow a potent declaration to echo. In contrast, seated straight across the wide table, Marco Rubio provided no such acknowledgement. He merely wrote something tiny on a yellow legal pad, one short word, set his pen down deliberately beside it, and looked up. He peered at her above the top rims of his glasses, sporting a look that seemed almost affectionate, maybe even slightly sad. It was the gaze of a person who had heard that exact formulation previously, though in another language, articulated by people who felt its significance much more profoundly than she ever might. In roughly 20 minutes, that precise statement was fated to resurface and totally ruin her morning. This occurred because a man whose own mother had cleaned hotel rooms simply to flee a country, exactly like the one she was now debating, was going to ask her to perform one incredibly easy task. He was going to request her to speak one lone name. Just one. And right there, in a packed room, aired across 3 major television networks, with the unforgiving, staring red lights of the broadcast cameras pointed at her, she was going to discover herself entirely incapable of doing so. To totally grasp how that one arrogant statement morphed into the most excruciatingly drawn-out quiet of her political life, we must go back roughly 20 minutes earlier to the point when she genuinely assumed she had stepped into this chamber to claim a win. The congressional meeting space was much more crowded than the official schedule might have indicated. Murmurs had traveled through the Capitol that the Secretary of State was dropping by the House to address questions about the Venezuelan crisis. Moreover, gossip had circulated that the famous New York representative had deliberately asked for a slot to talk. The press desks were packed 3 rows thick against the back wall. The viewing gallery was stuffed arm to arm, with the excess audience squeezed firmly against the side barriers where guards usually maintained an open aisle. Hidden away somewhere in the 4th row, sporting a modest gray cardigan and clutching a creased event schedule firmly in her hands, sat an older woman. Right now, literally nobody was noticing her at all, though by the time the morning finished, her visage would be recognizable to the whole country. Ocasio-Cortez walked in with her usual flair, striding as though the room owed her something, and she was there to gather it. She dropped her hefty folder onto the table with a soft but very deliberate thump. She tidily arranged a thin stack of paper documents next to her arm. Papers she had specially compiled, showcasing the secretary's own past remarks conspicuously highlighted in vivid yellow. Prepared for combat, she moved her mic exactly 1 inch nearer to her mouth. She directed her eyes across the long desk at the main individual the press had come to tape, determining, as she habitually did, that she fully understood his nature. This was the fundamental reality she believed about Marco Rubio, a belief she sensed deep in her bones. She felt certain he was a political compromiser. She was completely sure he was a person who had previously cared deeply about Venezuelan refugees, only to trade their welfare for an elite position at the power table. She had shown up this morning to prove precisely that to the whole nation. She held the indisputable proof. She possessed his legislative voting history concerning temporary protected status for exiled Venezuelans, the exact program he had helped to tear down. She kept the highlighted papers prepared, handling them as if they were a primed firearm. When the committee head eventually gave her the floor, she grabbed the chance like someone taking the final word in a dispute she had been winning for years. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Rubio, I want to start by being totally clear about what this meeting is and what it is not," she said. She let her voice take on its usual sermon-like rhythm. "Because I truly think the American people are drained by political showmanship. I think they are exhausted from watching men in exorbitant suits using the language of freedom to excuse government policies that, practically speaking, make children starve. Therefore, let us skip the drama today." A soft murmur washed through the audience. Not exactly a noise of agreement, but an eagerness for what would come next. "You have spent most of this past year talking about the agonizing suffering of the Venezuelan people," she went on, gathering speed now, her pace steadily rising. "And I consider that quite intriguing. I consider it intriguing because the people causing the worst destruction upon normal Venezuelans, The people who are purposefully denying them food and medicine are not situated in Caracas. Several of them are working right inside this exact building. A handful of them are sitting right at that desk. She allowed the charge to linger heavily in the space. There are people living in this country who have never had to flee anything in their whole lives. Individuals who have never known what it is to be hungry or stateless or afraid. And those are exactly the kinds of people who exploit the suffering of brown families located south of our border as a simple abstract idea, as a political argument, as a handy tool. She aimed those statements at a man whose mother had cleaned toilets in a Miami hotel simply so her children would never need to face hunger in a country where the state would kidnap your kids if you bravely spoke out. She threw this claim right at him, completely unaware of the paradox, and she would stay unaware of it for another 15 minutes. Rubio showed zero outward reaction to the insult. He possessed a very distinct stillness about him, the quiet demeanor of a person who had been in numerous rooms and learned the reality that the loudest individual is almost never the winner. He let her finish her sentence. He let the applause she had expected utterly fail to happen. He waited for half a second longer than was socially polite, and then he leaned deliberately toward his own microphone. The first thing he did was to voice his thanks. "Congresswoman, thank you," he expressed. "I honestly mean that. That was a very intense statement, and I do not doubt the passion behind it." He took off his glasses, folded the earpieces, and laid them on the wood desk. "I am going to try to keep my side of this conversation fairly simple. I am not here to give a long speech about freedom. You are right to point out that we have endured too much of that. I would greatly prefer to merely talk about a few proven facts, along with a couple of your very own quotes. And I think that will take us to where we must go." "Go right ahead, Mr. Secretary," she answered, a slight, self-assured smile showing on her face, the exact smile of someone who assumes their adversary has just stumbled aimlessly into an open field. "Let us definitely look at my statements. I strongly support every single one of them." "I am glad to hear that," Rubio replied. "Hold tightly to that, the reality that you support them. We will return to that in a moment." He didn't right away grab any of his sorted papers. That was a signature characteristic of his, something that experienced watchers of his tactics always expected. He never went straight for the throat when his rival was visibly prepared for a hit. Rather, he started the conversation with small, seemingly innocent questions. Mild inquiries offered almost as courteous pleasantries. He asked about how long she had been following the political situation in Venezuela. She replied with clear pride that she had been tackling the issue since her first year working in Congress. He then questioned if she considered herself a careful student of the Latin American area, or if she would portray her activism as originating more from a foundation of moral duty and emotional sympathy. She proudly stated that she argued from both angles, claiming she saw no conflict between the two, and strongly noted that she would never apologize for showing empathy. "No, ma'am, absolutely nobody is asking that you apologize for having empathy," Rubio explained. "I want to be extremely clear about that detail. Empathy is not the problem here today." He intertwined his fingers. "I merely want to understand the exact limits of your empathy. Because there is the action of caring, and then there is the following matter of who you allow yourself to aim your anger at. And those two subjects are not naturally the same. I experience anger aimed at institutional unfairness wherever I chance to find it," she debated. "That is a strong answer. I would like to submit it to a small test, if you will let me," he remarked, angling his head a bit. "When the executive branch formally recognized the opposition leader down in Venezuela a few years back, the person whom the rest of the democratic international community recognized too, you spoke on the public record. Do you remember the exact words you used to characterize that move?" "I called it exactly what it was," she retorted rapidly. "A severe overreach. A perfect example of the same imperialistic drive that has profoundly undermined that whole hemisphere for the last century." "Imperialism. That was indeed the word you picked," Rubio agreed, pretending as if he were just keeping a precise record. "So, the person trying to run a valid democratic vote, that move represented imperialism. I just want to ensure I have the right labels in my head, considering I am a simple guy and I often get mixed up. The voting effort was imperialism, and the person who purposely declined to release the true results of his own country's election. What was the describing word used for him? I have constantly condemned anti-democratic conduct coming from all sides. He let that exact wording hang in the room for a short second. You always seem to find the plural version, Congresswoman. All sides, both, the region, the dynamics, extremely vague vocabulary, all of it. Phrases that offer enough theoretical room for a massive amount of individuals to hide inside. Therefore, please let me ask you something extremely straightforward. Something small enough that even I can understand it. During all the years you have devoted to publicly talking about Venezuela, speaking from the heart, speaking from moral duty, all of it, have you ever, on a single instance, whether before a live television camera or in printed text, explicitly called the person who governed that country a dictator? The room fell into quietness. It was that very specific kind of silence that drops over a space when every person there is eager to hear the answer, yet stays a little afraid of what it could be. I have kept a steady stance against dictatorial actions in every single one of its forms, she answered. That is basically not what I asked about, Congresswoman. I asked specifically about one individual human, one lone name. Did you ever call him a dictator? I oppose the anti-democratic tactics performed by his government, which understandably included the denial to share the official voting numbers. His government? Rubio nodded his head in a sluggish, purposeful way, looking like a customer who had just received exactly the food he requested at a neighborhood restaurant and wanted to admire its presentation for a second before eating it. His government, not the man himself. I understand. Kindly keep that detail in mind too. You are juggling a few distinct ideas now. I really hope they do not get too heavy. And it was right at that moment he performed the tactic that absolutely no one in the whole room predicted. It was the exact move that entirely shifted the path of the morning, largely because it wasn't a trap she could see closing around her. He didn't pull out his own selected proof to fiercely read at her. Rather, he reached completely across the political divide to her half of the argument. He took out a single sheet of normal paper from his own file, looked down at it, and a gentle, almost respectful look washed across his face. You wrote a statement some time ago, he noted, about this exact subject. And honestly, Congresswoman, you expressed it much more beautifully than I ever could. Because of this, I do not want to just recite it out loud to you using my rough, flat Miami accent, only to have you blame me later of reciting it wrong, reciting it without the right feeling, or purposely twisting your original meaning. He smoothly slid the paper across the shiny wood of the desk toward her, gently setting it face up so she could easily read her own formally released words. These are your own remarks, from your authenticated account, carrying your own name. It is a sentence you wrote. Would you be kind enough to grant me the favor of reading it out loud for the sake of this audience? Purely so that no person can argue I tried to put words into your mouth? She cast her eyes down to the document. And right here is the crucial piece you have to understand about why she finally picked it up. Because if you don't understand this particular psychological aspect, you will guess she was just being dumb. And she was nowhere near dumb. She was intensely proud. The words typed on that paper stood for ideas she completely supported. They were points she had made on national TV broadcasts, hypotheses she had strongly upheld on scores of public stages, and viewpoints she had never once been embarrassed about maintaining. He wasn't giving her a shameful mistake. He was offering her what she resolutely thought to be her absolute best talking points. He was basically asking her to deliver her own main point, using her own unique voice. And she had spent her whole professional life being complimented, continuously told that her speaking style was her best feature. Thus, she didn't see a hidden trap, she only saw a stage. She lifted the paper from the table and began to recite it. Her voice was strong because she profoundly trusted the core message. To properly tackle the present refugee emergency, we must initially start by looking at American foreign policy and the broad international forces that are actively creating it. Her chin tilted up slightly as she moved through the grand statement. The wide, extensive embargoes pushed by the Trump and Rubio governments have played a major part in violently pushing millions of people out of the country of Venezuela. Any earnest talks about the surge of refugees must thoroughly tackle that fundamental cause. She placed the paper back onto the desk and stared at him, emitting an almost triumphant feeling, totally sure she had just effectively recorded her main argument into the formal congressional transcript, using her precise chosen words. Yes, I definitely wrote that quote, and I firmly back it. The harsh financial penalties you individually pushed for forcefully displaced millions of blameless individuals. That is a proven truth. That is an unquestionable reality. Those stand for real, living families, Mr. Secretary. And you are free to twist your face into whatever look you want, but you have zero ability to make their pain fake. No, ma'am, Rubio replied in a quiet voice. I would never try to make them fake. I am personally familiar with those families. He let that remark sit for a single second. I truly want to show my thanks to you for reciting that. You spoke it strongly. You recited it as if you genuinely meant it, and I am sure that you do. He bent forward just a tiny bit. Now, I have just one small, subsequent request, and then I will quickly shift the discussion ahead, I promise. You deliberately put two exact names inside that specific sentence. You purposefully added my name to it. You intentionally put the past president's name inside it. You were very precise. Therefore, I need you to look at that very same paper and recite out loud for me the exact section where you name the man those millions of hopeless people were actually running away from. She gazed down at the typed document. The main point of the phrase is about the embargoes, she reasoned. I totally grasp that. What I am demanding is for you to find the name for me. The person who ran the country they were fleeing. Please, speak his name out loud to me right from your own published quote. His actual name is not the core of the issue, Senator. Forgive me, it is Secretary now. But that is totally okay, he answered, his tone completely empty of any intense anger, a strategy which somehow made the comment hit with even more power. And I hear your argument, that his name is missing from the writing. Actually, that happens to be my whole main point, Congresswoman. You wrote a statement detailing exactly why 8 million people left their homes, and you managed to find the needed room inside it to fault 2 U.S. individuals, me and the president. Yet you somehow failed to find the room inside it to add the one specific guy whose cruel jail systems they were frantically running off from. You just recited it out loud yourself. We all watched it. There is plenty of wording on that piece of paper. His name just doesn't happen to be among them. The first laugh broke out right then. It wasn't a huge burst of laughter. It welled up from the audience seating, quiet and quick. A man sitting in the third row swiftly covered his mouth with his hand, eventually failing the struggle to hide his chuckle. A security guard positioned by the side barrier abruptly felt the need to deeply study the design of the floor tiles. She had succeeded in putting America's governmental mistakes on the paper, while totally leaving out the ruling tyrant's name in her own statement, and then recited it out loud to a national audience without even noticing the obvious gap. Ocasio-Cortez was fundamentally not the sort of person to give up command of a room without fighting a huge battle. She had walked this unfriendly ground before. She knew the landscape of political fighting, and she instantly used the exact tactics she normally depended on whenever the debate ground started to fall apart under her feet. She tried to completely change the main topic of the argument itself. I see exactly what is happening in this chamber, she stated, her tone rising, quickly finding its old powerful echo, mostly because justified anger was a feeling where she had always felt fiercely guarded. This is simply a planned act. This is a person who is highly talented at this particular maneuver, turning a serious debate about huge human misery into a short, popular social media clip. So let us truly talk about names, Mr. Secretary, given that you abruptly have such an intense interest in them. Let us talk about the idea of temporary protected status. Let us tackle the 500,000 Venezuelan citizens who were living legally within the edges of this nation. People who fled the very tyrannical government you constantly preach to me about, and whom you, individually and in written records, ordered the Department of Homeland Security to forcefully expel. I have the records right here. She lifted one of her own intensely colored pieces of paper. Her hold remained completely stable, and the political blow she threw was totally real. You clearly stated that protecting them from expulsion was, and I read exactly, against the national interest. You used 15 years fighting for these homeless people, and then, the very exact moment it became a politically useful action, you traded away their protection. Thus, do not sit opposite me and try to preach to me about who truly cares about the people of Venezuela. You had 500,000 of them safely in your hands, and you paid for their return trip. And one has to give her this particular credit. It was a very strong comeback. It hit hard. The writing tools held by the reporters at the media desks started to scratch wildly. A young staff member located behind her gave 2 strong nods of agreement. The female viewer sitting near the front, who had been laughing just seconds before, looked downward at her knees. It was powerful because the core claim was historically true. It was completely noted in the official history. And for a brief second, the whole emotional current of the room violently switched its direction, rushing quickly back to her side. She felt the change. She used its energy, and the power kept going. It stayed strong, and you could actually feel that recognizable, commanding presence flowing back into the space like a rising ocean wave. Right behind Rubio, a helper bent forward and whispered something quickly into his ear. 2 short, brief phrases, a hand half covering the mouth to hide the specific words. The TV cameras filmed the action, even though no mic could pick up the sound. Rubio took in the details without even caring to turn his head. He gave the tiniest of nods. And whatever that hushed information was, it didn't change his look by even a tiny bit. He merely slid one of his own, sealed envelopes a tiny bit nearer to his hands, purposefully leaving it tightly closed. The audience around them noticed the tiny motion. You could actually feel the whole chamber realize that something important was held inside that manila envelope. And he was purposely declining to open it. Not just yet. And that very action of holding back created a real, choking stress that no degree of yelling or political showing off could have ever made. The anticipation hung for about 15 seconds. It possibly could have gone on even further, but Rubio wouldn't break. He wouldn't take a defensive stance. And importantly, he completely declined to do the very thing her fierce attack was meant to make him do. He refused to sink into a small, complex debate about the tiny specifics of migration rules and then lose the crowd's focus in the bureaucratic details. He let her entirely conclude her point. He allowed the blame to completely strike the space. And then, he executed a move that was much quieter than anything anyone had psychologically braced themselves for. "You are completely correct," he said plainly. The entire room seemingly stopped taking a breath. "You are totally correct that I supported the ending of that exact program. And you are correct to mention that it was an extremely hard decision to make. And you are also correct that there are many families who suffered pain because of it. And I have stressed over what happened to those exact families much more than you will ever possibly trust a guy in a pricey suit stresses over anything." He gave the confession in a dull, completely even voice, totally empty of even one bit of drama. And that emotional emptiness proved to be vastly more destructive than any fierce yelling back could have ever achieved. "I am absolutely not going to stand in front of this group and fake that it was an easy thing or a neat process. It definitely wasn't. If you want to fight that specific legislative war, we can surely do it, and you might even win parts of it. But that is basically not the battle you journeyed here to start today, Congresswoman. You came here with the clear goal of telling the nation that I have no sympathy for Venezuelans. And I really want to discuss that, because I believe that you truly believe it, and I believe you believe it because of a life event you have personally never had to experience. And directly there, for the very first time during the whole morning session, a mask seemed to actually pull away from him. The refined ambassador disappeared. The careful, calculated, 99-0 approved Secretary of State stepped into the shadows. And what remained beneath it all was just a modest guy from West Miami. "My own mother carefully cleaned rooms in a hotel," he shared. The committee room dropped into a massive, heavy silence. "My dad stood for hours in back of a liquor counter at different parties, serving people who never once found out his name. And he constantly poured their drinks until 2 in the night, only to force himself home and do the exact same thing the next day. They did those exhausting jobs right here in this exact nation, because they had earlier fled an island country where one single man had decreed that the regular people were not allowed to leave, and were not allowed to protest, and were not allowed to pick. And if any person bravely attempted to, that man had very specific places where he could lock them away. He laid one hand completely flat over the closed folder sitting by his arm, the exact folder the broadcast cameras had been intently watching. At last, he flipped it wide. He didn't pull out a thick legal paper to fiercely wave at her. Rather, he pulled out one single, lone physical picture. It was obviously old, its initially bright tones having faded. He didn't theatrically lift it high in the air for the media lenses. He just gazed at it in silent thought, and then softly placed it face up on the wooden table, turned so that only the people sitting in the first couple of rows could see the picture. "That is the lodging establishment," he remarked softly. "Somebody mailed it to my congressional office earlier this morning, before I traveled here, because they understood the topic of the meeting. That right there is the worker delivery bay my mother stepped into every single morning for 11 years. I hold on to it because on days just like today, I find it helpful to actively recall that the individuals we are currently discussing are not just a debate point. They had a back door, they possessed a time punch card, and they possessed a name that nobody at the lavish gathering ever tried to memorize." He carefully shut the envelope again. "You constantly continue using this exact sentence. You used it 2 times today. You claim these folks are running from sanctions." He gently moved his head side to side. "Congresswoman, I was raised entirely next to these folks. I poured them coffee. I sat inside their dining rooms. They are definitely not running from a sanction. A sanction is a sheet of paper. What they are desperately escaping from is the very thing that you have devoted 6 whole years in this governing group refusing to connect a single name to." "You are not allowed to do that," she interrupted. And this time, there was real fire behind her remarks. Real fire. She could practically feel the space drifting away from her yet again, and she frantically jumped for the one tactic that had previously never let her down. "You do not get to use your private background as a weapon to close off a legislative argument. That is exactly the maneuver. You purposefully disguise a bad rule in a tragic tale about your mother, and you basically dare anyone to doubt it. And if they do, they are abruptly going after your mother. I am not going after your mother, Secretary. I am going after your voting history. And those are totally separate items, and you realize they are separate. And you are purposefully hiding behind the first to dodge explaining the second." It was a solid hit. It was frankly the greatest one she had ready. And for a passing moment, the shared feeling of the room shook once again. It shook because her claim held a legitimate point. Private history can truly be a defense. And she had effectively called the political maneuver out loud. It actually might have succeeded. But it was exactly then, in the tiny half-second of silence after she spoke, that the older lady sporting the modest gray sweater rose up in the 4th row of the seating area. She didn't yell. She just stood up gently, her hand still keeping a firm hold on the creased event schedule. A security officer instantly moved toward her, exactly the way they always respond. Rubio noticed her motion, and he lifted one hand merely a little bit toward the committee head. "Mr. Chairman," he asked gently, "I would politely request the patience of the group just for a moment. Let her speak her mind." The head paused, then gave a tiny nod, and the officer halted. The lady's tone was not stable. She talked in heavily accented English cautiously, speaking with the measured caution of a person who senses every single word taking a deep toll on them. "My name is not important," she declared to the quiet space. "I am from Maracaibo. I arrived here in 2018. She aimed her eyes entirely at the paper still gripped in Ocasio-Cortez's hand, the text with the bright colors. "I heard you confidently state we were fleeing from the financial penalties. I have heard very many individuals say this. I wish to tell you what we were actually fleeing from." Her grip clenched around the schedule. "They captured my boy in 2017. He was 24. He traveled to a march and he failed to come home. And for 9 painful months, I had no idea if he was breathing. And when they lastly permitted me to visit him, he was unable to hold a glass of liquid because of what they had intentionally done to his fingers." She wasn't weeping. She was living beyond weeping. "I have carefully listened to you for a lot of years. Because you are well known and you state you speak for folks like me. You state these things. And still, in all that prolonged duration, I never, not a single time, heard you speak his name. The exact name of the guy who forever carries my son's fingers on his soul." She angled her chin toward Rubio. "You easily speak my nation's name. You easily speak this guy's name. You never speak his—" She gently lowered herself back down into her seat. No one chuckled at that. That comment sank down someplace far more profound than a chuckle, down into the bedrock area of a room where matters get finally settled. Ocasio-Cortez's lips parted, and for the very first time all day, nothing emerged clearly. "I am so deeply sorry for your terrible grief," she uttered, and the feeling was genuine. You could clearly hear that it was genuine. "And I would never, ever try to lessen what you— I understand that you are truly sorry, ma'am, Rubio cut in, not to break her off meanly, but softly, almost sweetly, so that the whole space bent forward to hear the sound. I fully trust that you are apologetic. I do not believe that you are a fundamentally mean individual, Congresswoman. I desire that put on the public transcript, too. I believe you are something that is actually slightly tougher to excuse in this city. I believe you concluded a great while ago which exact nations are formally permitted to be the bad guy. And the individual living in Caracas was just never on your permitted list. Because publicly identifying him would have meant formally confessing that the very political framework you have spent your entire profession protecting can actually cause this. He pointed just slightly at the lady in the gray sweater, at the unseen thought of her child's ruined fingers. With total respect, Secretary, she started defensively. We are far beyond respect, Congresswoman, he declared, not severely, but almost tenderly. The precise manner you would speak it to a person you had really run totally out of tolerance for. Respect was 20 minutes prior. Respect was here before you stood straight and stated to this whole chamber that panicked individuals who run from tyrannies are nothing except a political tool. You expressed that to a space holding a lady in it who literally laid her own child's liberty to rest inside one. He lifted her colored paper back off the wood desk, the precise one she had recited out loud minutes before. He raised it up so the TV lenses could plainly film it, the way you would elevate a thing that was completely obvious. You arrived here this morning determined to force me to state I do not care regarding these folks, he wrapped up. And rather, you went on to recite to me your own written phrase, using your own unique tone, holding my name clearly in it, and his name nowhere to be spotted in it. He laid the paper down totally flat. You tried to forever mute me with their intolerable agony, ma'am. And you could not even muster the capability to utter his name. 11 words located right at the conclusion of the battle. Perhaps 10. And they achieved precisely what 10,000 yelling words never could have managed. The chamber was totally quiet now. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez gazed downwards at the tiny pile of paper materials sitting by her arm. The specific files she had intentionally carried. The vividly colored ones. The weapon she had strutted in holding. She stared at them closely for a prolonged second, and then, extremely softly, completely conscious that the lenses were still aimed at her and the crimson filming light stayed solid, she collected the scattered papers together. She straightened the jagged borders a single time, out of sheer, deep-seated habit. And she flipped the whole pile face down on the desk. She creased the stack crisply once down the center line. She pushed it a couple of inches away from her body, moving it towards the vacant part of the table. The exact manner you place down an item you have resolutely decided you're not going to utilize anymore. She then lifted her writing tool, copying the motion an individual makes when they are getting ready to scribble down a memo, doing something, anything, with their fingers. She kept it floating above the yellow notepad, and then she laid it completely back down without writing a single letter. The committee head cleared his throat into the crushing silence and officially inquired if the polite woman from New York wished to proceed with her comments, since she legally still possessed time left. She did not. She gave up her remaining time utilizing simply 2 words. I yield. And in a room where you could have effortlessly heard a needle drop to the ground, the tiny, dull, papery noise of her own paper materials being flipped face down was the very loudest element recorded on the tape. And it is the exact noise, if you return and view the video carefully, of an individual who arrived to violently snatch something away from a rival, merely to learn before the whole nation that she had carried the totally incorrect firearm. Because the firearm was made of her own phrasing, and they were completely loaded the whole time. And they had been aimed right at her own body. By the minute the session ended, the video segment already possessed an internet label, and the label was nowhere near complimentary to her. Someone had neatly sliced the 90 seconds, displaying her arrogantly reciting her own phrase out loud. Then his silent, devastating demand to locate the absent name, and lastly, her actively flipping her own paper files face down upon the desk. They released it online. By middle afternoon, you could not literally swipe for 10 seconds on any digital display in the United States without it popping up once more. And this was the precise detail that should have terrified her the most if she had been able to experience anything yet other than the burning warmth spreading across her face. The audience was not debating about financial penalties. They were not arguing regarding international affairs or temporary shielded status or any of the policy matters she had intensely hoped that morning to center on. There was merely nothing remaining to debate. They were simply viewing on a continuous replay a famous woman reciting a message with 2 U.S. names highlighted in it, get informally questioned for the third tyrant's name, and hold no reply. Eternally. The main-time night TV news began with the very same paused picture. The representative, with her pile of papers flipped face down beneath her own palm. One particular channel showed the video beneath a graphic that contained absolutely nothing, except the secretary's last devastating remark. It showed simple white characters placed on a dark background. Zero analysis was included, merely because none was needed. In the resounding stone corridor right past the main room entrances, a journalist effectively stopped a Democratic lawmaker who had voted alongside Ocasio-Cortez many times throughout the prior years. He strongly declined to have his name printed in the press, and he anxiously looked both directions down the huge hall before he talked. Everyone in the faction has recognized for years that she held a giant blind spot regarding that exact guy, he confessed, talking softly and quickly. We all just kind of mutually decided not to press on it. You can label Israel practically whatever you desire in our political group. Whatever, except that one man down in Caracas. Complete silence for years. He shook his head. She lastly got asked the straightforward question audibly, on video, by the lone guy in D.C. whose relatives actually survived it. There is no media statement that repairs that. And he quickly marched away before the journalist could even get the sound recorder entirely raised. A junior lower-level employee who had been waiting by the rear barrier described the incident to a companion on the telephone that night. She was employed by a Democratic team, and she confessed she could not quit fixating on it, and experienced a bit of shame admitting that out loud. It wasn't the basic politics she mentioned. She didn't truly care heavily about the political consequences, not following a 14-hour workday. It was the unique auditory noise of the paper documents laying face down in a space that's silent. You could vividly listen to it, this tiny, dull scrape of paper literally flipping over onto its belly. And then, absolutely zero noise at all. She mentioned she guessed she would keep hearing that empty blankness for a severely long time. She stated it was the most deafening silence she had ever actually stood within. And she admitted that she had not been capable of looking the representative in the eyes afterward and that she didn't completely understand the reason. The morning lady in the gray sweater from Maracaibo eventually exited the structure at a sluggish speed, totally solo. The strictly creased schedule stayed in her grasp. And outside in the neighboring corridor, securely out of the masses of broadcasting lenses, the Secretary of State was silently standing near the escape door because he had purposefully questioned an assistant which route she had taken. He did not deliver a massive address. He did not carry along an official cameraman. He simply held her hand, softly in both of his own for a short second, and whispered something to her that was too silent for anyone else to understand, communicating in fluent Spanish. She nodded in comprehension, and that was the total extent of the interaction. Then he released her hand and continued to stroll the opposite direction down the vast stone hallway. Beyond the yelling journalists frantically shouting his name. Beyond the vacant meeting space where the single most heavily referenced lady in government had finally, following all these years of speaking, run completely out of words to utter. He had committed 15 long years to uttering the oppressor's name, and he silently uttered it one final time on his journey out the exit gateway, murmuring it to no person specifically, communicating it the precise manner you speak a basic fact that you are never, ever going to quit repeating.